So first of all, I do want to thank Kevin and Fern and the team at Community Business for inviting me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. And I definitely want to, again, recognize Goldman and Barclays for their leadership on this particular issue. Goldman in particular, not only for hosting today, but they also were kind enough to host our third Out on the Street Summit here in New York on April 29th. Lloyd Blankfein, their CEO, was our host, and we actually had 5 other CEOs participate, which I'm incredibly proud of. A bit about Out on the Street, and then we'll kind of dive into a few learnings. And I'd encourage you, if you've got questions or things that you'd like to discuss. I know Kevin had emailed out the opportunity for that, but please start thinking about that, because we do have time at the end for Q&A, and I'd love some virtual interaction to the extent we can do that. So just a quick background. I started on Wall Street as an investment banker and worked at a couple different firms. I was actually out from the very beginning, but had a bit of a hiccup with my first firm. I had a homophobic manager, and so I ended up switching firms and stayed out after that. So I had a bit of the experience of being out and being back in the closet, and from a professional perspective, and can definitely attest to the same findings that the research that we've done, and I know Community Business has done as well, around the impact of your productivity, your engagement, your willingness to stay at a firm, et cetera. I then switched sides of the world and went into private banking here in the US and started the first team on Wall Street to focus on LGBT financial planning. We grew that to $1.5 billion business here in the States, and that led me into the diversity space, where I was head of D&I for Credit Suisse and head of strategic D&I for Merrill. I launched Coda, which is my firm, 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, and one of the first initiatives I wanted to build was Out on the Street. And the goal of Out on the Street is to bring together senior LGBT leaders and allies to discuss business opportunities in the LGBT community, as well as connecting these senior leaders to each other from a career perspective, from a networking perspective. But ultimately, the goal for both of those pieces is to hopefully drive LGBT equality forward and move the movement forward and move acceptance and inclusion forward. We started with 6 firms. We've now grown to 16 firms. I launched Out on the Street in Europe this last year in London, and we're going to be bringing it to Asia this fall, which I'm really excited about. So hopefully those of you who are there and listening today will get involved. We'll be hosted actually by Barclays in October. Date will be probably the second week, the 14th or 15th of October. I'm hoping to have that date actually this week, so we'll be announcing that quite shortly. From an impact perspective, and why I think it's been interesting from an ally perspective, what I've been able to see with Out on the Street specifically, and James actually said it very nicely, the tone at the top is vitally important to any leadership initiative, but with allies, I think especially. Prior to Out on the Street, there had never been an opportunity for more than one CEO to speak about LGBT issues in the same place at the same time. Last year we had 4 in New York with Brian Moynihan, Lloyd Blankfein, Paul Singer, John Viemeyer. We had another 4 in London, and then we had another 5 this last year, 3 weeks ago here in New York. And I think the positive and the impact of that is that the CEOs themselves now have a platform to talk about why this matters to them. And I think that's an exciting opportunity for us, and I think it's something that I hope that you can leverage and take away even just in conversations, because I find that when you say that the CEO of Bank of America and the CEO of KPMG and the CEO of Ernst & Young and the CEO of Goldman Sachs and a number of other CEOs, Moody's, all actually care about this and are visibly and vocally out as allies, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think it really does provide a massive impact. So that's basically what I just went over. You can see the 16 firms that are now part of Out on the Street. The other thing that I'm proud of, and this is by design as well, is that we're really targeting with Out on the Street a senior leadership audience. So we're almost 70% managing director in our attendees. And I think, again, that provides a forum for these senior leaders who can actually change the culture. I think you have to have both. You have to have the grassroots and the senior leadership. But prior to Out on the Street, I really sort of saw a void and didn't see that sort of senior leadership visibility or the opportunity for that visibility. And I really think that that's the visibility that is key when you're looking at these ally programs. And I think a lot of the firms have realized that as they've been building them. So I figured what I'd do today is give you sort of a broad swath. I'm not going to spend too much time on the definition of allies, although I will talk briefly about it. And I figured I would share with you a couple of the best practices that I've seen from the U.S. and from the U.K. and Europe. I know from Kevin and from some of the leaders at some of our banks in Asia, a number of the banks have started ally programs, and a number of the firms, I assume, that are participating today have started ally programs. So I'm hoping that I can share some best practices for what we've seen, that hopefully it'll help you as you're wherever you are in the ally journey. So what is an ally? I think it's probably self-evident, but it's always good to start with a baseline. An ally is someone who advocates for equal rights and or fair treatment of LGBT individuals. And I have both in there because I think you don't have to be an activist to be an ally, but a lot of allies find themselves becoming activists, and activists with a little a. So you can be an activist simply by being visible and saying that LGBT exclusion is wrong. Again, as James mentioned, being a part of a minority who's been persecuted, he can understand, and that was one of the drivers that made him an ally. I think a lot of allies find that there's some sort of a key to bringing them into the ally conversation. And so I would say, as you're looking to build an ally program, or if you're trying to seek out allies, figure out what the commonality is. Find what the shared experience can be between the allies that you're trying to bring into the program and their personal experience. I've found a number of allies who are senior leaders or junior leaders, actually, who you never actually knew would have been allies until you actually asked the question. So I find that it does take a bit of bravery starting an ally program and actually going to a senior leader and asking for them to engage in an ally program. But I think what I've found anyway, and what I've heard from leaders who've done this, is that you do actually get a much more positive response than you might otherwise have thought. And I want to underscore the two pieces that I mentioned. One is the visibility. As an ally, even if you are an ally and you consider yourself an ally, you have to come out as an ally. And I think that's a bit of a different concept. But you can't be sort of quietly and passively an ally. You actually do have to let people know that you're an ally. I jokingly tell senior leaders that their employees and their leaders are not mind readers, right? So if I'm a closeted lesbian employee in your team and I have no idea how you feel about marriage equality or how you feel about LGBT inclusion, then I'm less likely to come out to you. And LGBT employees who are in the closet are constantly looking for clues for the safeness of an environment. When we doing research for our recent Power of Out 2.0 research, which I think everyone will get after this, one of the quotes that struck me was one of the people that we interviewed from all the different firms that we interviewed said that it took about 10 positive visible acts for her demonstrated from her company for her to feel comfortable coming out, but it only took one negative act for her to go back in the closet. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you're talking to allies, because it's not just a one-time thing. There's a constant continuum that a company has to be on once they start an ally program. So why create these ally programs? Well, I think there's some obvious reasons, and I think there's some exciting sort of less obvious reasons. As James mentioned, and I think Fern mentioned as well, the impact of having an ally program can be significant, from the inclusion, the engagement, and really the satisfaction and the happiness of your employees who are LGBT. So that's one piece of it. But I think what's interesting is, number one, I've actually seen a lot of ally programs create a pathway for LGBT employees to come out. So a lot of LGBT people identify as an ally in the workplace first to test the waters, to see how safe it could be for them to come out, how it sort of feels, who's actually in the room, who's sort of there with them, as a way to come out. And so we've actually seen a statistically significant number of people who first identified in the workplace as allies who ultimately came out as LGBT. That's not something that I think a lot of people realized when they started the ally programs. The other thing that I think has been interesting in terms of why creating these ally programs is that there's a broader impact that happens. So if a senior manager is seen to be an LGBT ally, there's a significant chance, and I think almost 95 to 100%, that he or she is going to be perceived as an ally to a lot of other groups. So to the extent that that ally visibility creates conversation around a woman who is pregnant and feels comfortable now speaking to her manager because she knows her manager is an ally to LGBT people, or an employee who has an autistic child or a special needs child who has to deal with that or has just found out about that or is seeking help or guidance, etc., or just needs his or her manager to know that this is happening outside of the office because it could cause some conflicts with schedule. Being an ally can actually have a much broader umbrella and impact than just on LGBT people. So I mentioned some of the data and the support of senior executives. So I think I guess it's on your left as well. So on the left-hand side, we asked our respondents in our Power of Out 2 survey how likely they were to be out at work if they weren't out at work. And almost twice as many said that they would be out if there were senior executives who were supportive. And by supportive, they meant allies. They meant visible, etc. And then we sort of dove a little bit deeper and said, what are the top 5 reasons, regardless of senior support? And the number one reason was knowing that my colleagues would be supportive. Almost the number one reason. Number 2 reason was being in a relationship and not wanting to hide it. So I think those are neck and neck. But I share those statistics with our straight allies as well, because if you think about sort of the traditional straight ally or straight leader in a company, if you go into their office, what do you see? You see pictures of family. You see sort of their personal life, if you will, on display without them necessarily thinking about that. And I highlight that to them because very often I've heard over the years, oh, well, being gay is something you just, that's a personal thing. You don't need to bring that into the workplace. And I always push back on a senior leader who says that because I say, I would challenge you as a leader to do that for 24 hours. Don't talk about your personal life. Don't talk about your kids. Don't talk about your grandkids. Don't talk about golfing with your buddies. Whatever the engagement is outside of work, and you'll realize how almost impossible that is, or how draining that is. One of the two. If you can achieve it, you're spending an awful lot of energy doing it, and that's energy as a leader I'd rather you have spending at your desk or on a project. So I think if you look at it from that's a reason that actually people do want to come out, permitting people to be out and sort of visibly showing that as an ally, I think does drive both of those conversations. The other piece to this is the difference in sort of ally programs and what we're actually calling active allies versus passive allies. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this. When Goldman started their program in 2005, as James mentioned, the concept of being an ally was pretty basic. It was check the box, absolutely, I'm an ally, sign me up. And then they sort of progressed into the mentoring program, et cetera, which is wonderful. And he mentioned some of the recognition they've gotten. Actually, the Human Rights Campaign here in the U.S. gave them the Innovation Award 3 years ago for their ally program, which was quite a big deal. But it sort of progressed. And what we found is across all the companies that have ally programs, that started ally programs, there's a need to actually redefine what an ally actually is, and more importantly, what's expected of an ally. So in our research last year, we actually asked a swath of straight respondents, did they consider themselves an ally? And men and women, 70% of men, 83% of women did consider themselves an ally. Fantastic, awesome, great job, wonderful, glad to hear that. But then we actually gave them a list, which you see there to the left, of 7 different actions that an ally could take. And we asked them how many of them had done at least 2 of the things that you see on the left. And that number dropped to 8% and 19%. So we started thinking about this as, okay, being an ally requires some action on your part. You can't just be quietly, passively an ally, as I said before. You actually do have to take action. You do actually have to be active as an ally. Now, I'm a little challenged with the 7 that we chose here for a couple reasons. One, the actions that we show there on the left are reactive. They're not proactive. So supporting a coworker who's come out of the closet assumes that that coworker has now come to you and you're reacting. Attending an event is potentially proactive, but the rest are actually, you've spoken up because you heard a homophobic slur in a meeting or in a client meeting or in an internal meeting. And so those are all, as an ally, I'm reacting to something that I'm seeing in the environment. But what I challenge companies and leaders to think about to be active allies is more on the proactive side. So what can you be doing as an active ally? And so one of the things is being a mentor and being a sponsor. And I want to differentiate those two. A mentor is someone who you go to with challenges, with problems, to discuss your work environment, to get advice. A sponsor is someone who actually uses political capital on your behalf in a corporation or a company or a hierarchy. And they're very different, and they have very different roles. And in my experience and in a lot of data, actually, a sponsor is infinitely more impactful and important. And if you don't have a sponsor in your career, first of all, get one. But second of all, your career will have a lot more challenges. Sponsors are the people that actually pull you through the organization. They're the ones who use political capital that they have on your behalf. You may not even know you have a sponsor. And so an example of a sponsor could be a manager 3 levels above you who's impressed with your work and knows that you're up for promotion. That manager calls your manager and says, Sally's up for a promotion. I think she's fantastic. You should definitely give her the promotion. She has my support. You may actually not know that that senior leader called on your behalf, but that senior leader is your sponsor. It's in the States, we have an expression that we call the good old boys network, and it's similar in the UK. That is basically an old school sponsorship model. It's people helping other people through an organization, through contacts and networks, etc. And if you look at it from minorities, etc., women have an infinitely higher likelihood of success if they have a sponsor. Men sponsor each other naturally. People of color actually are, everyone is actually better with a sponsor, but in terms of the people who have sponsors, the more sort of away from the straight white male norm you go, the fewer people who actually have sponsors in an organization. On average, women have 4 sponsors in their careers. On average, men have 11 sponsors in their careers. So from bringing this back to an ally, that's actually something that an ally can do proactively. You can proactively choose to sponsor LGBT employees, and the impact is going to be significant. The other thing from an active ally perspective that I think is vitally important, and it's really simple, it's not nearly as involved as sponsoring, which really isn't that involved either, is just telling your story. So as James just did, why did he become an ally? What were his concerns? What was important to him? That makes him an authentic leader, and that makes him a visible ally, and that makes him connectable to you. At our first Out on the Street Summit at Deutsche Bank, Linda Riefler, who was the global head of research at Morgan Stanley, introduced a panel. And one of the things that I tell all of our leaders who speak is that I don't want them to ever slip into sort of what I call HR speak and read an HR policy. I want them to say something authentic and something real and something that matters. And so I always say that I'll interrupt them and take them off the stage if they sort of veer into inauthentic speech. And Linda actually, as she was introducing this panel, said, you know, that she was an ally and she'd always been an ally, but she'd always just sort of thought she was an ally but didn't really know why. She just thought it was a fairness issue. And then she said, about 6 months ago, that changed when my 13-year-old daughter came out to me. And you could just hear a hush in the room. And she said that completely changed my perception, not just on my work environment, but obviously what I'd learned at work was helping me at home. And she thought, how do I actually deal with this? What are the challenges? And what I love that she did is she actually asked her daughter for what she should say out on the street. And so she pulled out a piece of paper and read what her daughter's recommendations were for her to speak at our summit to a bunch of senior leaders on Wall Street. That one story resonated with so many people in the room, and I still, 3 years later, hear about that story because she was active, authentic, and she was very visible. But you don't have to have a family member who is LGBT to be an ally. To use Lloyd again, Lloyd Blankfein has spoken out on the street the last 2 years. And Lloyd just says it's a matter of fairness, and he wants the smartest people, and that Wall Street is a meritocracy, and the market doesn't care if you're gay, straight, tall, short, black, white, etc. The market wants the best and the brightest. And I think that's a completely different and appropriate and great way to look at it. But the key to both of these is that they're being active and visible. You wouldn't know that they were an ally if they weren't active and telling you that they were. So as it relates to ally programs, I'm calling it a progression, and I'm a little challenged with the word progression because I don't want to sort of make judgment on any of the points that we have here. But as I mentioned, a lot of companies started with you're an ally, congratulations, all the way through to we actually have some companies now that provide ally certification programs, Goldman Sachs being one of them, Wells Fargo as well. And I think there's some interesting best practices. One of the simplest things that I've seen companies do is just add the A to LGBT whenever they're talking about it. So if you've got an LGBT network, rebrand it as an LGBTA network. Because allies need to know that they're welcome in the room. They need to know that they're welcome at the events. They need to know that they're an integral part of what you're trying to achieve. A lot of companies, and you see Barclays highlighted here, have tent cards or deal toys. Bank of America actually has in the States we call them tombstones. I'm not sure that's a vernacular that is a global vernacular or not, but when you close an investment banking deal, you get a little lucite that talks about that deal. So Bank of America did lucites for allies so that they could have them on their desk. Moody's, interestingly enough, has on their email signature, so they've got their SIG block that has name and title and address, etc. At the very bottom it says, I'm an ally of the LGBT group at Moody's. Simple, but if you think of the number of people that person emails on a daily basis that see that they're an ally, not just in their company, but outside their company, I think that's a brilliant idea, because then you're actually leveraging it from a client development perspective potentially. And I think the interesting thing about diversity in general, but LGBT specifically, is you absolutely never know who you could touch from being an LGBT ally or being open about LGBT issues. So the Moody's employee who's sending an email that says they're an ally could be sending it to an LGBT client who hasn't been out to Moody's until they see this and they think, oh gosh, wow, I can be out now. I've deepened that client relationship. At Out on the Street this last year, the CEO of Vestar Capital, Dan O'Connell, was speaking, and one of the things that he spoke about was the fact that he became an ally when his son came out to him. But the interesting thing that he spoke about, which was not about his son coming out to him as much as who the first person he called was. He called his Bank of America banker, Mark Steffens. Why? Because Mark had come out to Dan 3 years prior as Mark was going through his coming out process. And Mark is a vice chairman at Bank of America. He went through this whole coming out later in life and was petrified of coming out to his clients because he didn't know what the reaction would be. Dan was very supportive, but what I thought was more fascinating was because Mark was brave enough to have that conversation with his client then 3 years later was able to reach back out to him and say, my son just came out to me, what do I do? That client relationship is incredibly solid. Not that it wasn't before, but it added an entire new layer to it. And I think as you're thinking about ally programs, I encourage you to think about what the client impact can be and what the external visibility impact can be, not just from receiving awards and accolades, but really on a day-to-day, hand-to-hand, blocking and tackling in your day-to-day life with clients, how you can actually use this to drive things forward. In terms of other best practices, a lot of companies are using allies for recruiting. So when you go on campuses or if you're going to events, having allies talking about LGBT issues is a very different perspective, and I think it sends a positive message. Actually, KPMG did an interesting thing for their ally program a couple years ago. They did a photo campaign, and they had their senior leaders in T-shirts that said, my brother is gay, my sister is a lesbian, or just simply, I'm an ally. And they posted them all over their offices globally. And I thought that was an interesting take. So it not only made those leaders authentic, because that was them sharing something about themselves that they're their colleagues probably didn't know prior to that. But it also was a different take on gay pride, because they did it during Gay Pride Month. I think the final piece on the ally programs that I think has been impactful is actually figuring out how you recruit allies, how you bring them into the discussion. So Ernst & Young actually has ally-focused outreach. They actually have a work stream as part of their LGBT network whose sole purpose is to bring in allies to discuss how they could be an active ally, why they should be an ally, what the impact is, and sharing best practices. Because I think, especially for straight men, there's a bit of a hurdle to get over sometimes, because there's an unspoken fear that they would be perceived to be gay, and sort of what's behind that fear and how can you sort of make that fear go away is a discussion that you need to be upfront with and actually have. And I think it's a pretty easy thing for people to get past, but I think sort of naming the elephant in the room is an important way of helping them get past that. Morgan Stanley has actually done a lot in Europe and EMEA, specifically in countries that are not as LGBT friendly. They've actually started ally programs there as a way to bring an LGBT network at a later point. Just as a lot of companies have here in the States when they're starting new chapters. Actually, Goldman, for example, in Utah, in Salt Lake City, Goldman's chapter of, I believe it's 300 people, their LGBTA chapter of almost 300 people is 90% allies. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that they would not have expected. The last thing I want to mention here in the progression are ally certifications. So I talked to you about sort of, it's one thing to be visible, it's another thing to actually be active in doing some of these things. Some companies have actually put in place ally certification programs. And the certification programs vary, but I think the positive is that they actually give allies sort of a checklist, if you will, of opportunities and expectations for them. One is just some basic training on language, because I think a lot of people, when they first become an ally, don't really know what to say. Do I say gay? Do I say lesbian? Do I say homosexual? Do I say partner, spouse, husband, wife? All of the, what is transgender? What is transsexual? All of the different terminology is sort of a baseline that an ally needs to know. So it's almost like giving them a toolkit. But it also gives them an expectation of whatever the company's LGBT employees really need from them. Do they need them to mentor? Do they need them to be a sponsor? Is there an expectation that they attend an event, that they speak about it in their town hall if they're a senior executive who holds town hall meetings? That's one of the things that I always recommend. If you're a senior executive, talk about the fact that you're an ally in a very visible global setting, because that sends a huge message. And it can be subtle. It doesn't have to be very sort of pounding the table, I'm an ally. It can be as simple as saying, I had dinner with my lesbian mentee, and we were talking about our last quarter and how great we're doing with new clients. It can be a very subtle thing, but that sends a huge message to your LGBT employees. I want to just sort of close with just a couple sort of final thoughts. As I mentioned, ally programs really do obviously have the benefit of being or creating an inclusive workplace environment where your employees can be out. And as Fern mentioned, the fact that so many people are not out in the different regions. I think 71% in Hong Kong, 82% in India, and 94% in China. So we've obviously got a long way to go until people can be open and out in the workplace. I would encourage you to think about ally programs and really how ally programs could help you on that journey. One of the questions that we received beforehand was around sort of what do companies need to have in place prior to having an ally program. And I think, quite frankly, I'm not sure you have to have an awful lot in place. I think an ally program can be one of the first things that you implement. Because to get senior people who are LGBT to be out, they've got to have a safe space. And it's much safer for allies to be out as an ally than it is for gay people to be out as gay. So I think to the extent that if you're looking at wherever you are as a company in this progression, an ally program I think is a really key piece. And so I want to close with an example or a little anecdote that we've seen here in the States that I think really resonated with me. And it really applies to diversity broadly. So when I chat with folks who I can actually ask in the room, which I realize I can't really ask you via the video here, but I ask folks, here in the States, why in the United States we have sidewalk ramps. So if you've been to the States, in most major cities, I think actually in all major cities, at the corner of a major intersection, there's a sidewalk ramp where the sidewalk dips down. And so I asked the audience, why in the States we have sidewalk ramps? And generally someone in the audience is savvy enough to know that when the U.S. passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, that required wheelchair access from streets into buildings, etc., after a certain period in time. So then I say, great, so we did this accommodation for a very small number of people, right? How many people are actually in wheelchairs? A very small percentage, 1% of the population, 3% of the population. Who actually uses those ramps? Who actually takes advantage of those sidewalk ramps? Mothers with strollers, people with suitcases, delivery people with hand carts, etc. In fact, an entire industry of suitcases probably was built, the wheelie suitcase, around the fact that you actually now have sidewalk ramps. And so the example there to me is that we took something that was for a very small population, and it's something that the broader population is able to use and to leverage and makes better for the broader population. So you took something from the margin and applied it to the whole. And I think diversity and allies and LGBT programs like this are exactly the same thing. While you may perceive that you're doing something for a small population, the impact on the whole of the organization could be astronomical. So I want to thank you for giving me the time today. I hope the rest of the session is fantastic. I think we've got a little bit of time left. I'm not conscious of, I've lost a bit of track of time where we're closing, Kevin, but if we've got time for questions, I'm happy to take some.
Yeah, I think we have about 2 minutes for questions. And
so that sounds like one then.
Yeah, so maybe we can actually just take 2 questions. Anyone in Hong Kong have a question?
Is an ally program only for senior executives, or would you also invite people from other levels to be an ally?
That's a great question. I would say anyone can be an ally. I think you've got to have grassroots, you've got to have people who are allies to their colleagues, to their peers, but you've also got to have senior executives. I find, and the reason I've sort of focused on senior executives is because the tone at the top makes it easier for everyone else in the organization to be an ally. But I would say having allies throughout the organization is absolutely vital. So the goal of starting with seniors is that it permeates the entire organization. If you've got an analyst or an entry-level person who feels comfortable enough to be visible as an ally, I think that's amazing and fantastic and should be absolutely supported. So I think ally programs themselves should be geared to anybody that's interested. But I would encourage you, if you're starting one, that you do need to have a focus on senior level folks, because that's going to shift the tone in a much more quick, I guess, or in a faster manner. But I think it's important to have both.
Just for context, you've talked about the rate of outness in Asia. Can you just compare that with perhaps America and London, just to give us a sense of how different it is? Yeah, absolutely, happy to. The Power of Out 1 research that we did 3 years ago, 52% of employees were in the closet in the US, and 48% of employees in the UK and Europe were in the closet. So significantly fewer employees. 2 years later, when we did the Power of Out research, that had actually dropped even further. So 59% of employees in the States were out, and 64% of employees in the UK were out. So there's a huge difference in what we see in the UK, the US, and Europe with the numbers that Fern shared in Asia. And I think from a company perspective, if I were a CEO of a global corporation, I would look at that and be really challenged with that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm focused on bringing Out on the Street to Asia, is to hopefully sort of push that discussion and to leverage the collective power of these 16 financial services firms to really, hopefully, provide a catalyst or a lever to have that discussion and to say, I don't want, if I'm a CEO, I don't want 91% of my employees who are gay to not bring that part of themselves to work. I want 100% of themselves I want 100% of them to be out and to bring themselves to work. So there's a very, very marked difference. Now, I realize there are significant cultural differences, obviously between the US and the UK and Europe, as well as obviously all the different various regions in Asia. So I realize that there are different challenges that Asia has that the US, the UK, and Europe don't have. So I think it's, every country and every region's got to have its own time frame and progression. But I still think we can do better.
Thank you.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Todd. Do you know the specific day that Out on the Street will be in Hong Kong?
I think it's either October 14th or 15th. We're still just finalizing. It's that week. It's the second full week of October. And as I mentioned, Barclays is hosting it. Venue to be determined. I'm hopeful that we'll have it this week and we'll be sending out an announcement. Out on the Street Europe is November 19th. KPMG is hosting it in Canary Wharf.
Excellent. Okay. And also you mentioned the Power of Out 2.0, and that's research that you've extended to community business, and we'll of course be sharing that with all the participants here today in the audio conference. All right, so thank you so much, Todd. Appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for having me.